Picture a map. Not the one you know, not 13 scrappy colonies fighting for freedom against a distant tyrant. Picture the other map, the one hanging in a war room in London in 1775. On that map, America isn't a nation waiting to be born. It's the crown jewel of the most powerful empire on Earth, richer in trade terms than India, protected by the greatest navy ever built, defended just 12 years earlier by British soldiers who bled and died to save these very colonists from the French and their native allies. So here's the question almost nobody asks. How does the most dominant military power in the world lose a war against farmers, merchants, and lawyers 3,000 miles from home? This isn't the story you've heard 100 times. This is the American Revolution seen from the other side of the Atlantic, from the palace at St. James's, from the benches of Parliament, from the deck of a Royal Navy warship. This is the story of how Britain won nearly every battle that mattered and still lost everything. The empire at its peak. To understand how Britain lost America, you first have to understand how completely Britain believed it couldn't. In 1763, Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War. It was by any measure a staggering victory. France was expelled from Canada. Spain ceded Florida. British territory in North America had effectively doubled overnight. London's newspapers called it the greatest triumph since Rome. And the American colonists, who had fought alongside British regulars against the French, were as proud as anyone. They were British subjects, and they had just watched their empire become the largest the world had seen since antiquity. But victory is expensive. The war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt. The taxes nobody wanted to pay. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. In 1765, the Stamp Act, a tax on virtually every piece of paper in colonial life, from newspapers to playing cards to legal documents. From London's point of view, this was modest. The average British subject at home paid far higher taxes than any American colonist. Britain wasn't asking the colonies to fund the empire, just to cover a fraction of the cost of troops still stationed on colonial soil for colonial protection. But there was a problem London hadn't accounted for. The colonists didn't just object to the tax, they objected to who was taxing them. The colonies had no representation in Parliament. No colonial voice sat in the House of Commons. And so a phrase began echoing through Boston taverns and Virginia courthouses that would prove more dangerous to the British Empire than any French army. No taxation without representation. To British ministers, this was a strange argument. Most Englishmen back home didn't have direct representation either. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham, despite having massive populations, elected no members of Parliament at all. The system was called virtual representation, the idea that Parliament represented the interests of the entire empire, not just the districts that elected its members. To London, this wasn't a pattern of misreading. What followed was almost a decade of the same cycle, repeating itself with the momentum of a landslide. London would pass a tax or a law to assert authority and raise revenue. The colonies would resist, through boycotts, through pamphlets, through street violence. Britain would back down partially while insisting on the principle of its authority. And each time, the trust eroded a little further. The Townshend Acts of 1767 taxed glass, paint, paper, and tea. A war Britain didn't want and didn't expect to lose. By April 1775, British General Thomas Gage had a straightforward mission: seize colonial weapons stockpiled at Concord and arrest rebel leaders. It should have been a policing action. Instead, shots rang out at Lexington Green, and by the time British troops limped back into Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties at the hands of colonial militia who fired from behind trees, walls, and farmhouses, a style of fighting British officers considered almost dishonorable. Even now, London did not believe this was a war for independence. Most in Parliament saw it as an uprising to be crushed swiftly, a rebellion, not a revolution. King George III himself viewed the colonists not as a nation seeking freedom, but as subjects in open rebellion against their lawful sovereign, egged on by a small faction of radical agitators. It's a crucial point. For most of the war's first year, Britain was not fighting to conquer. Winning the battles, losing the war. Here is the part of the story that rarely gets told. Britain was extraordinarily good at fighting this war. British and Hessian forces captured New York in 1777, forcing General Washington into a desperate retreat across New Jersey, with an army that was starving, freezing, and disintegrating by the week. They captured Philadelphia, the rebel capital, in 1777. At battle after battle, Brandywine, Germantown, Camden, British regulars outfought, outmaneuvered, and outlasted their colonial opponents. By most conventional measures of 18th century warfare, Britain was winning. But military victory and strategic victory are not the same thing. Britain could capture cities, but it could not hold the countryside. Every American city taken required troops to garrison it, stretching British forces thinner and thinner across a landscape too vast to fully control. Washington understood something his British opponents did not fully appreciate until too late. He didn't need to defeat the British army. He simply needed to avoid losing his own, to keep the war alive long enough that Britain's will and the war becomes a world war. This is the moment that, more than any other, explains why Britain ultimately lost. France had been waiting in the wings since 1775, quietly funneling money, gunpowder, and muskets to the American cause, not out of love for Republican ideals, but out of a hunger for revenge. France had lost Canada and much of its American empire to Britain in the 7 Years' War just over a decade earlier. Every humiliation Britain suffered in America was, to Versailles, a chance to even the score. After Saratoga proved the Americans could actually win a major engagement, France formally allied with the United States in 1778. Spain joined against Britain in 1779. The Dutch Republic entered in 1780. Almost overnight, what had been a colonial rebellion became a global war, with British forces suddenly needing to defend not just America, but the West Indies, Gibraltar, India, and the English Channel itself against the combined navies of Europe. This is the detail that changes the entire narrative. Britain didn't primarily Yorktown, the hour the Empire lost America. General Cornwallis marched his army onto the Yorktown Peninsula in the summer of 1781, expecting the Royal Navy to resupply and evacuate him if needed, just as it always had. It was a reasonable assumption. British naval superiority had been a fact of life for the entire war. But in September 1781, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse defeated the Royal Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake and sealed off the peninsula from the sea. Washington's American army, combined with French troops under Rochambeau, surrounded Cornwallis by land. Trapped, outnumbered, and cut off from rescue, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. Nearly 9,000 British and Hessian soldiers laid down their arms. Legend holds that as the British band played during the surrender ceremony, they chose a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether or not that detail is entirely accurate, it captures something true. For Britain, that is precisely what had happened. When news reached London, Prime Minister Lord North reportedly received it as a man might receive a mortal wound, repeating over and over, "The verdict from London." In the decades that followed, British historians and statesmen would look back on the loss of America with a strange mixture of grief and pragmatism. Edmund Burke, one of the war's most persistent critics within Parliament, had warned from the very beginning that no empire could govern free-born Englishmen across an ocean without granting them the liberties they believed were their birthright. His warnings, dismissed for years, would be remembered as prophecy. And yet, here is the twist history rarely highlights. Britain's loss of America did not mark the decline of the British Empire. It marked something closer to a turning point. Chastened by the experience, Britain shifted its imperial ambitions toward India, Africa, and the Pacific, eventually building an empire larger and more powerful than anything lost in 1783. In an almost unbelievable turn, within a single generation, Britain and its former colony would become each other's largest trading partners, and within a century, closest allies.
So was the loss of America Britain's greatest failure, or its most important lesson? Perhaps both. It was a war fought by an empire so certain of its own power that it never seriously considered defeat, against a people whose most powerful weapon was simply refusing to stop believing they deserved a voice in their own governance. The Crown never lost a war of muskets and cannons in any decisive, singular sense. What it lost, slowly and unmistakably, was the argument. And in the end, in the history of empires, that has always mattered more.